Hello, welcome back. Today I would like us to consider an article that was published in August 2017. The article was published in the journal Third World Quarterly. I suspect that many of you will be familiar with the title, which was The Case for Colonialism. Its author was Dr. Bruce Gilley, who is a professor of political science. The article itself was met with fury and outrage. 2 petitions were immediately launched on change.org, demanding for the article to be retracted. There were demands for the journal's embattled editor to be fired. 15 editors promptly resigned in protest at the article. Gilley himself became the focus of a howling social media mob who called for his tenure to be revoked and for him to be fired. Some even called for Gilley's PhD to be revoked. Things became so vicious that both the journal editor and Dr. Gilley himself received credible threats of violence. These threats eventually led to the withdrawal of the article itself, which is no longer available. What was Dr. Gilley's crime? Well, he had the temerity to suggest that perhaps colonialism was not all bad. He suggested that we should look carefully at how the old colonial powers established local governance, because maybe, just maybe, there might be valuable historical lessons to be learned. He argued that, in some instances, colonialism created a net good, and if true, some of these practices might actually be beneficial when developing strategies relating to failed or failing states, particularly through establishing stable government, institutions, and sound infrastructure. Gilley argues that nations who embrace and built on their Western colonial legacy, Singapore, for example, have fared better than those who followed an anti-colonial nationalist ideology. Dr. Gilley's right to express his opinion has had some support within academia. Noam Chomsky opposed the demands to retract the article, saying it would open dangerous doors, and Jerry Coyne wrote an article on his website, Why Evolution is True, supporting Dr. Gilley's right to publish. The interesting thing about Jerry Coyne's article is that even though he had not read the Gilley article before it was withdrawn, he expressed doubt about any potential merit that colonialism might have had. Indeed, in his article, he states the following, and I quote, "Surely, colonialism has in the main been bad, and if Gilley maintains otherwise, I disagree, but he apparently didn't. He argued that in some instances, colonialism has created a net good. Maybe he's right. Perhaps there have been cases of colonialism or certain actions of colonial powers that could cause an overall improvement of a dysfunctional nation. I can't think of any, for eventually all those nations demand independence, but it's certainly something worth discussing." Coyne expressed his support cautiously. He guarded his position with care because the progressives have cast the die and arguments surrounding certain issues are moulded by a particular progressive narrative. The orthodoxy in this instance is the notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing. Indeed, the left credits colonialism with an almost supernatural power to sweep away everything good in its path, and with equally magical power, it is able to make permanent everything that is bad in its wake. This propensity for manifest evil is so all-pervading, it is often held responsible for post-colonial suffering, even in countries who had never actually been subject to colonial rule. So, we can't blame Jerry Coyne for being cautious in his approach on the subject, particularly in the light of the consequences that flow from challenging the orthodoxy of the day. But this leads Coyne to present a counterfactual position, because America itself is the product of colonialism. Have the Americans been blaming the British for every setback, misfortune, or disagreeable outcome for the last 200 years? Do Americans today perceive themselves wretched victims of British colonial rule? Maybe some do, but I would suggest that most would consider such a suggestion an insult. Dr. Gilley in his article made the point that colonialism offends the sensibilities of contemporary society, and that may be the case. But offending the sensibilities of progressives does not an evil empire make, and we have no way of knowing what would have happened in those countries in the absence of colonial rule. As Dr. Gilley pointed out in his article, the best we can do is compare ex-colonial countries against those that did not have a significant colonial history, such as China, Ethiopia, Liberia, Libya, Saudi Arabia and the like. Such studies might provide a measure of comparison to help identify what, if anything, were the distinctive effects of colonialism. So too does research into pre-colonial histories that, almost by definition, reveal comparatively weak institutions, societies riven by tribalism, and subsistence economies. Another interesting point made by Dr. Gilley in the article is the failure of the most vociferous critics of colonialism to adequately address the issue of slavery. In his article, Dr. Gilley states, and I quote, "Finally, there is the simple epistemic virtue of falsification. This is most pointed in the treatment of what was undoubtedly a benefit of colonialism, the abolition of slave trading. Anti-colonial critics squirm and fidget over this issue because it puts the greater strain on their colonialism is bad perspective. The result is a constant stream of revisionism. It did not happen fast enough. There were mixed motives. Not all colonial officials supported it. Former slaves remained poor. Former slave owners remained rich. It should never have existed in the first place." In the wake of the publication of this article, there was no shortage of commentators pontificating on the particular evils of colonialism. No atrocity left unmentioned in the collective condemnation of this period of European history. But there is something missing from the conversation. There is an elephant in the room, and it is not a baby elephant by any stretch of the imagination. If colonialism is pure evil, does this make anti-colonial movements the embodiment of all things good? Dr. Gilley dedicated an entire section to what he described as the costs of anti-colonialism, and it makes for sobering reading. The primary example he used was a case of Guinea-Bissau. He introduced this section thus: "It is hard to overstate the pernicious effects of global anti-colonialism on domestic and international affairs. Since the end of World War II, anti-colonialism ravaged countries as nationalist elites mobilized illiterate populations with appeals to destroy the market economies, pluralistic and constitutional polities, and the rational policy processes of European colonizers. In our age of apology for atrocities, one of the many conspicuous silences has been an apology for the many atrocities visited upon Third World peoples by anti-colonial advocates." Dr. Gilley in his article paints an outline around the elephant, but he cannot seem to bring himself to the point of acknowledging its essential character. We might ask ourselves, what is the fundamental difference between Singapore, Belize and Botswana, who seem to have thrived, and the post-colonial countries like Zimbabwe or Guinea-Bissau, who can only be fairly described as humanitarian disaster zones? What exactly is the progressive left carefully not talking about? And why do we see this noticeable divergence of outcomes after the conclusion of World War II? The clue is contained within the quotation. What ideology is hostile to pluralism and would seek to destroy free markets? The elephant in the room is the dead hand of Karl Marx, or more properly, the adoption by nationalist political movements of Marxist ideology. Dr. Gilley focused on Guinea-Bissau in his article, and that seems like an extreme case, but it is not. Of the 80 countries that threw off the colonial yoke after World War II, at least half experienced similar trauma, while most of the rest limped on, achieving little for the next 60 years. Third world despots have for over 6 decades raised the spectre of recolonization to discredit democratic oppositions and ruin their economies. Yet there is virtually nothing written about most of these post-colonial traumas, since the received wisdom is that anti-colonial movements were the victims rather than victimizers. Scholars in full Eurocentric mode prefer to churn out books on colonial atrocities, or to suggest that all the tribulations visited on these countries are colonial legacies, rather than something to do with the follies and failed utopian ideologies inflicted on these countries by their anti-colonial leaders. A few post-colonial states are in reasonable health. those whose moral imaginations were not shrouded by anti-colonial Marxist ideology. These successful countries have had the most productive encounter with modernity, emerging as leaders of what W. Arthur Lewis called the creative third world, but most of the rest remain stuck in anti-colonial protest identities, with dire consequences for human welfare. A sobering World Bank report of 1996 noted almost every African country has witnessed a systematic regression of capacity in the last 30 years. The majority had better capacity at independence than they now possess. This loss of state capacity is not a trifling matter. It translates to the loss of tens of millions of lives. The situation is not getting better. The evidence is plain to see, often played out on our news channels. Zimbabwe, when it gained sovereignty in 1980, was considered the breadbasket of Africa. It had a booming agricultural sector and a wealth of human capital. But over the past several decades, Mugabe has managed to squander nearly all of it. Almost a quarter of his people are currently in need of food assistance, and 72% live in poverty. Within a generation, Mugabe has turned a comparatively wealthy nation into a humanitarian disaster zone. Zimbabwe, after several decades of Marxist-inspired nationalism, cannot even feed its own people. Its government, brutish, corrupt and inefficient, its people starving under the rule of a ruthless tyrant who had promised everything but delivered nothing other than famine and misery. In his article, Dr. Gilley states that, and I quote, "The foreign policies of these former colonies continues to be driven by a sense of victimhood and entitlement, rather than rational self-interest or global responsibility. This means that every time the world is desperate for a coordinated response to a human, political or security catastrophe, in Sri Lanka, Venezuela or Zimbabwe for instance, the voices of anti-colonialism intercede to prevent action. As it turned out, the more serious threat to human rights and world peace was not colonialism, as the United Nations declared in 1960, but anti-colonialism." We are coming to the end of this particular adventure together, but before we finish, I would like to say a few words. First thing is to make it plain that Dr. Gilley never referenced Marxism in his article. That is an inference that I made. In this, I might be wrong. You might read the article and come to a completely different view. And that is the whole point. We read or listen to someone's ideas and try to make sense of them in the light of our own understanding. Ideation is the single trait we possess that separates us from the beast. The right to express what we believe is our only defense against tyranny. To drive this point home, I will quote Joseph Stalin, who said, and I quote, "Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas?" I dedicate this video to those who protested the original article, those in academia who worked towards its removal, and particularly those academics who resigned as editors in protest. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.